QuickBooks Pro Desktop 2021 Bills. Enter, sort, and pay. Let's get into it with Intuit's QuickBooks Pro Desktop 2021. Here we are in our Get Great Guitars homepage. We currently have the open windows open. You can open the open windows by going to the view dropdown and selecting the open windows list. We're now going to be entering bills and paying those bills. So note, in a prior presentation, we talked about the pay bill feature, and we went up top in terms of the purchasing and paying of inventory, which is going to be this line up top. Now we're going to be at the line at the bottom. So when you purchase inventory, it's a similar process, but we might have a purchase order depending on the circumstances, and then we might receive the inventory with a bill on it, which means you're basically at this point entering a bill in a similar fashion as you would here, except you would tie that basically to the purchase order, and then you would be having the pay bills. So the bills that would be there under that circumstance would still be here in the pay bill section that we would then sort. Now we're going to go into like the monthly bills, the things that we normally enter each month, and go through everything other than inventory that you might enter. Once again, as you do this, remember that you could just, when you get the bills, as we did last month for normal bills like the phone bill and the utility bill, we might just write a check for them at the point in time that we get the bill. But in larger companies, and oftentimes it's useful to get the bill, enter it into the system, and then use the system to sort the bill. Oftentimes, and especially as we have more transactions, as the business gets bigger, cash management would be beneficial to us for us to hold on to the money as long as possible. So then we would want to pay the bill as late as possible. So instead of holding on to the actual bill without entering it into the system, we would like to enter the bill when we get it, because that will be closer to the point in time that we actually consumed whatever it is that we had. For example, the phone bill, if we enter the bill soon when we get it, that means that we're going to record the expense at the point in time that we enter the bill, which is closer to the time that we consumed the phone usage, which is, better accrual accounting. And then we can sort that bill and pay it whenever, which will be hopefully closer to the time period that the due date is, so that we will hold on to our money as long as possible and maximize our cash management strategy. So that's going to be our objective at this point. It's also pretty nice that you could sort the bills over here once you've entered them, and then you can pay them basically at one time, or if you need to print checks, then you can use this system. It's a nice system to be able to print the checks using this pay bills feature. Now, just note that as we enter the bills, like the phone bill and Verizon and whatnot, because we entered them as a check last time, we're not going to see that nice feature where it basically memorizes the last transaction as clearly as we would if we did the same thing from month to month. So before I do that, let's just enter a check just so you can see what I'm talking about. If we enter a check, I'm not going to enter it. I'm just going to basically enter one vendor so we can see what we're doing here. If we paid Verizon, for example, which is the phone company, and we had already paid Verizon in the past, then the vendor's all set up and it will memorize basically the expense most of the time as well, which will help us out with consistency. So for example, if I typed in Verizon here and said tab, then it memorizes the last transaction. I would probably have to change the number here, but notice down here it memorizes the account. So I no longer really I can basically do data input at this point, or I can allow someone else to do the data input without them needing to know much. All they need to do is say, oh, it's the Verizon bill, enter Verizon, enter the proper amount. It'll be going to the proper expense account. The data input becomes very easy. And that's really what your objective is. You want to be able to, if you're setting up the system, you want to set it up in such a way that you can do it when you're at your most tired state to do just the data entry, or where you can just basically give that to somebody else and have them do it without knowing much about anything. That's basically your objective. If you can set up your system so that you can provide it to somebody else that doesn't really know anything other than the data input, and be able to have them do it with as least effort as possible. And you want to do that with your own system as well, because that allows you to break up your work to that work that takes up your mind, right? Stuff that you got to think about, which is the setup process. And then you can do that work at those times when you're just trying to do some work but your mind's not fully operational, and you can just do kind of like the easy work, right? You can break those two things out and hopefully be more efficient. I think that'll be a more efficient use. So anyway, I'm not going to record this. I'm going to close this out and not record it. And instead, we're going to enter these items as bills now, because I want to practice for the second month more of the accrual process, putting them in as bills and then paying them. So I'm going to enter them as a bill. So I'm going to open up the bill. Notice the bill looks a whole lot like a check. We've seen the bills prior to this, but again, it looks a lot like a check. The only difference being that the bill means we're going to be increasing the accounts payable instead of what the check means, which is decreasing cash. So the rest of it's basically the same layout. So once again, I'm going to type in Verizon. We're going to pay the Verizon bill. Tab, I'm going to pay it as of the 28th. We're not going to pay it. We're entering the bill, but then we will pay it. We'll pay it right after. So we're going to enter the bill. And then tab. This is going to be for the 365, we're going to say. And down here, note that, and you might want a memo saying, hey, look, this is the bill, the month that's being covered and whatnot that we're paying. I'm not going to enter one here. Best practice is to enter a memo whenever possible. The expense did not populate down here as it did with the check, because we've never entered a bill yet for Verizon. If we had, it would populate in the same fashion as we saw when we saw the check. So that'll make it easier going forward. So I'm going to type in the telephone, because we know we have the telephone already set up. Same rules for checking out the expense accounts here. I want to make sure that I'm consistent. So I want to see what happened last time in terms of this particular vendor. Most likely follow that rule unless something is different. And if I have never used this vendor, I want to see what accounts the system, QuickBooks, has provided me with and see if I can use that account, because it's more likely to be standardized. If I cannot, only then would I add another account. So I'm going to say save on this one. And then let's open up the financial statements. So I'm going to go to the reports drop down, company and financial, go on down to the balance sheet standard. I'm going to change the dates with a custom report range up top, or customized reports, from 01/01/21 to 12/31/21, January through December 2021. And now we see that the accounts payable will be increasing. So there's the increase in the accounts payable, 365, double clicking in on that. There's the 365, closing that back out. That will also be supported with the subledger by going to the reports drop down. We can see that vendors and payables, then go into the vendor balance detail. And so there we have the Verizon, that 365 once again. The other side is going to be on the income statement, even though we have not yet paid the cash, because we're entering the bill and we're on an accrual system. So we're going to say the reports drop down, company and financial, P&L, profit and loss, changing the dates from 01/01/21 to 12/31/21. And there's going to be our income statement, and we see the telephone bill right here. Double clicking on that, we see the check that we wrote in January, and then the bill we wrote in February. So that's the difference between the two methods that we have used. Once again, if you enter the bill right when you get the bill, then you're going to be recording the expense sooner to the point in time that you actually consumed, in this case, the phone usage, which is kind of a better accrual basis. Although this time we're going to enter them close together. I'm going to pay the check soon, right after I enter the bill. But notice that would be closer to an accrual system, and then you can still wait and pay it at a later point if you so choose, which if you're working in like an accounts payable setting, that's always the objective, right? You want to enter the information into the system so you have it recorded, and then you want to be typically paying them as late as possible without being penalized on doing that. Would be the typical cash management type strategy you would be going for. Okay, and so now let's go back to the home page and let's check it out again. We're going to make another bill. So this one, it's going to be our cable company. So our cable company that for internet connection. So I'm going to say Spectrum is our cable company. We don't have that vendor set up yet, so I'm going to set one up. Tab. I'm going to quickly set it up. We probably don't need much detail even in practice on this one. If I'm just paying somebody, I just need to know who to pay, who to write the check to, or how to make the payment to whoever we're writing the check to. It's going to be as of 2/28. I'm going to say once again the amount 180. So then down here on the expense side of things, I'm going to say, okay, now we're paying for internet connection. Do we have an expense account for that? It might be a little less likely. You look at this and you say utilities. Yeah, maybe not the utilities. The telephone, well, you might be using like the telephone line or have some package deal, in which case you might do that. But a lot of times you might want to break that out. Notice that Intuit does actually provide something called computer and internet connection, which is nice. So you can pick that one. I could say, okay, I want that one. Now notice you might say, hey, the computer kind of confuses things, maybe because I don't want to be recording like a purchase of a computer or computer parts to it. So maybe you want the internet connection separately, and you're saying that's a nice line item, but I'd like to have just the internet expenses maybe. You can adjust that account. So then I would say, instead of making a new account, let's go to the lists of accounts. Say, well, let's go to the lists and go to the chart of accounts. And I'm going to say, I like that they gave me something with the internet, but I'd rather it just say internet, or I'd like to change the name. So I'm down here in the expenses item. I see this computer and internet. Let's right click on that and say, let's edit that thing. And maybe I just want to change it to internet. I'll say this is going to just be internet. And so instead of computer supplies, off the shelf software, online fees, and other computer internet, I'm just going to call it what? I'm just going to delete the whole description. It's just going to be internet stuff for like the internet expense. And then all that other stuff I'll put into computer supplies. I'd like to break that out separately possibly, right? So I'm going to say, all right, let's just do that. And then there we have that. And so then if I close this back out, so now it's just internet. So now when we see it there, so that's the way I would kind of approach that. If you see a name that you kind of like, instead of making a new account, which will confuse things, because if I had two accounts then, I might start posting sometimes to one, sometimes to the other. So I'll just go in there and tweak the name to what I think would work better. So then I'm going to say save and close. And then let's go to our balance sheet. So within the balance sheet, now we have the accounts payable at the 545. It's now been increased. So we've got the spectrum. If I double click on spectrum, that will of course take us back to the bill. So closing this back out. Notice this accounts payable is always going to have just bills and then paychecks. That's all that happens here. Like it goes up with a bill and then we pay it and then it goes back down. So closing that back out. If we then go to the vendor balance detail, we can see it too is at that 545, tying out to what's on the balance sheet. And now we can see that we owe Spectrum here that $180. So then if we go to the profit and loss, we can see that we now have this internet expense item there. So that's going to be what has been increased on that item. Back to the home page. So also note that you can start to kind of manage these as you've entered them in the vendor center. Or you can go to, and you can get to that vendor center by going to vendors drop down and the vendor center there as well. And you can check out what is owed by basically lining up these items. So you can go to each of the vendors, and that's another way that you could sort, how much you owe these people. You can also go to the transactions, and then you got the basically payable type of activity within the transactions. So if you wanted to go to say bills and see the data for the bills, you can go here. I have all bills that are shown. So then we have all bills. You could say, I only want the open bills possibly, and you could start to sort your bills in that format. And when you pay, you could double click on a bill, for example, and then you might say, I want to pay that particular bill. And you can go to that linkage to pay the bill and then go to your data input screen. I think that's less common to do on the pay side of things, because most people will probably go directly to this screen in order to sort things. So I'm going to close this back up and close this back up. In other words, I typically may not sort the bills that I owe as much using this function, although it's nice to know that it's there. Most of the time when you are going to pay the bills, you probably are simply going to go to pay bills over here, because it has its own sorting options that are pretty good right in here to basically pay the bills. And we'll do that shortly. But first, let's enter another bill. We're going to enter another one. This one's going to be the utility bill. We're going to say that we pay Edison, which we already paid by a check last time, or via check. So we'll type in Edison as of the 28th once again. We're going to be paying them $648. And so I'll keep the bill date there. Now note it doesn't populate down here because last month we did it with a check. If we had done it with a bill last month, it would populate for us down here automatically. The Edison, we have that issue. Do we want to group it together with like utilities, or do we want to break out the electric bill and versus the gas bill? I'm going to group it into utilities, which I think is still the convention normally used. Also note, as you enter these, you could assign a customer and make it billable if you so choose. So if you're in an industry of mainly like a job cost system where you're going to assign this out and create an invoice with it. We saw that with the inventory items in our system where we use that billable item. You could do the same thing with any kind of expense. So if you're saying, hey, if I usually like car auto usage or something like that, you might say, I'm going to bill this to a particular customer because that auto usage was me going on a job or something like that. And so then you could tie that out. So I'm going to say save and close. And so there we have that. And then let's go back to our balance sheet. On the balance sheet, we see that the accounts payable has increased again. Double clicking on it to see the detail. There it is. Double clicking on the 648. There's our bill once again. Closing this back out. Closing this back out. The next side is going to be on, or we also see in the vendor balance detail report that we have Edison here now. So there's Edison. The total's now at the 1,193, which tied out to what's on the balance sheet. And then if we go to the P&L, the profit and loss, we see now that we have the utilities. Double clicking on the utilities, we see last month we recorded it with a check indicated over here by the type. This time we recorded it with a bill, and that just means we paid it last time when we wrote the check. This time we entered the bill, and we're going to have to pay it when we pay the bill, which will then decrease the accounts payable. Let's do that now. Let's go to the payment side of things. So I'm going to go to the home tab. Now note when you're sorting this stuff, again, I think most people will sort it by just going right here. And if you're in accounts payable, if you're working in accounts payable, then you're going to have a whole lot of bills that have been entered, and you could sort this if you're at a fairly large company that will need that service. But there's other ways you can look at it. Obviously, you could take this report, the vendor balance detail report, and you can check out basically the bills that have not yet been paid. I can say, okay, Edison, we owe them. We could see, okay, Spectrum, I owe them. And I could double click on the bill that we owe them if we wanted to do it this way. And then I can go to the pay bill if I wanted to pay that particular bill and then pay it. But this would take you back to that same screen that you might use. Notice it filtered it for us here. So you're paying that one bill because it basically applied the filters. Or of course, I'm going to close this back out without paying it yet. I'm going to close this back out. You can also go to as we saw, the vendor center, and you can sort your bills in this way. And then again, you have the sorting options to see the open bills or the overdue bills, which none are overdue at this point. So you can have the open bills, and you can do the same. You could search different items within basically the payable cycle here. But I think most people will go directly to the home page and say, okay, I entered the bills now. Now I'm going to sort them and pay them with this screen. If I select that screen, it will then show you the bills that are outstanding. You could sort them. You could sort them by basically due before this date, or you could just show all of them as we have here. We see those filters that had been applied automatically when we linked the bill to the pay bill, and then you could sort by these options as well. Now, then if I select any of them, if I want to see the actual bill, if I want to click any of them and then go to the bill, then we can go to bill, and that'll take us to the bill that we had entered that we're now linking it to. Closing this back out. If we want to pay multiple of these items, then I can select multiple items. Let's say that we're going to pay Verizon and Spectrum, and we're not going to pay the Edison bill for whatever reason. We're going to keep the Edison bill open at this point in time. So then we're going to pay this as of 2/28. The method is going to be, I'm going to keep it at the check. We can print the check. So if I select to be printed, that means we have checks that are pre-made or we bought them. And in other words, we can't just print a check on a blank piece of paper. We have to have the pre-printed checks that we would have to put into the printer and then print this information onto the pre-formatted checks. We're just going to assign a check number. If you're doing some other payment other than a check, then you would assign something other than a check number to it, so that it wouldn't be taking up, basically a check number if you're doing another format of payment. So that it's going to come out of the checking account. I'm going to say pay the bills, and then I'm going to let QuickBooks, like if I wanted to assign a check that wasn't a check or something like that, I use something other than the check numbers on the check number sequence, but I'm going to let QuickBooks assign the checks. And then again, if you're doing this, if you're printing the checks, this is a great system because then you can do this option and have them print all the checks at the same time, right? If you're using the printer. But in any case, I'm going to say okay. It'll assign then the checks. So there's the two checks that were assigned. There's the numbers that were generated. I'm going to say done. I typically, whenever I do something to the checking account, like to look at the register just out of habit, the cash register. So you can go there by going to the banking dropdown, use register, or you can go, which I like to do, to the lists chart of accounts, and then I double click on the checking account to open up the register. Here's the 2 checks that we have written. Notice that they, although are checks, they have a different little name down here than check. This is like a normal check that we just wrote a check. This is a bill pay check. And if I double click on that bill pay, then you see the check down, but at the bottom it's a little bit different down here, this indicating that we are paying off a bill. And that's useful because if I want more detail on like what expense account was affected here, I can't just open this check. I have to go to the bill, because that's the form that's going to show which expense account was affected. So I'm going to close this back out and close this back out. And then if we go then to the balance sheet, within the balance sheet, we see the accounts payable down here has now been affected. If I double click the accounts payable, we see that we have these payments that were made, these 2 checks that were written now. If I double click on either one of them, we get to that check, but it's got the bill check, the bill payment check thing down here to indicate that it was payment for accounts payable. Closing that back out and closing this back out. If we go up top to the checking account, double clicking on the checking account, scrolling down to the bottom, we have these bill pay checks once again, but notice it's a check, but it's indicated in the type that it's a special check. It's a bill pay check, which basically tells us it was something that paid down the accounts payable. So it's nice to have that indication, even though basically, again, it's basically a normal check except for that difference, which tells us a lot because it tells us the other account affected, accounts payable. It also tells us that in the split area over here. Now the subledger, if I take a look at the accounts payable, we can say, okay, let's take a look at the detail account. So we'll take a look at the vendor balance detail. So now we have paid those items off. So here's the payment for Spectrum. Here's the payment for Verizon. The total is now $648, still outstanding, and that's the amount that has not yet been paid for the Edison bill. Notice you can also see that in the vendor center. If I go back to the vendor center and go back to the vendors here, now you can see the balances in the vendor center. Some people like to go here and see that summary in this area as well. So that's going to be it. Let's go to the balance sheet. If you're following along, you could check your numbers on the balance sheet. This is where we stand in terms of the balance sheet. Nothing has happened or let's take a look at the income statement. Something has happened to the income statement. Nothing happened in that last transaction, but something happened to the income statement. So let's go to the income statement, and we're going to say this is where we stand in terms of the income statement. And if you would like to tie out to the trial balance, which I think is the easiest form to do so with, let's go to the reports drop down. Let's go to the accounting and taxes and take a look at that trial balance. Changing the dates from 01/01/21 to 12/31/21, and then there is our trial balance.